Loki the Rapper, otherwise known as Darren, is an absolutely fascinating individual, I think. He's written this brilliant book, absolutely fascinating book. I really recommend everyone reads Poverty Suvari. It's about his own experiences in Pollock in Glasgow in a deprived working class community. It's a challenging book because it's not just taking on the right, but also the left, and it's this balance between social injustice and personal responsibility. But he's got so much to say on so many different subjects. I think this will be really fascinating. Lots of people wanted me to interview him, and I think you'll see why. You've done this book, The Poverty Suvari. What drove you to write it? How would you sum up what it is?
A lot of culture, news often leaves people scratching their heads because the reality with which they're being presented is so jarringly disfigured from their own experience. What I wanted to do was write a book that people from those backgrounds would read and see themselves accurately reflected in. The experience of living in poverty is so chronically stressful that it can impact everything from fetal development to how a person interprets threats, assesses risk, right on to antisocial behaviour, low educational attainment, coming into contact with law enforcement, and ultimately by understanding how the physiological experience of poverty, then you begin to have a more accurate profile of some of the pockets of society that have become disengaged or have become hostile.
There's a mass amount of research which shows a very strong link between mental distress and deprivation and inequality in society. You're far more likely to have depression and anxiety, and obviously with depression and anxiety you get self-medication, addictions, abuse, alcohol, drugs, food, etc. Do you want to talk about that mental distress, the damage inflicted upon people and your own experiences, and how we have that nuanced take about it?
Absolutely. Obviously when we talk about personal responsibility, it's quite a loaded term. So understandably on the left it's regarded as a kind of Trojan horse for cuts to public services and for example, a welfare system which currently is so hostile. It's using humiliation as a sort of motivation to get into work. So my argument is that the people who have created that system misunderstand how people at the lower end of the income scale actually interpret things. Using my own life as an example, and my experience is not unique and is actually too common.
I mean, when you were 5 years old, your mum took a knife to your throat in a drunken rage.
That story really begins with my mother's experience as a child growing up in a difficult community, in a difficult home. She was subject to violence of all sorts, including sexual violence, and ultimately her inability to process that trauma and manage the stress obviously manifests later as her inability to cope with having children. When adverse events happen, which they happen to middle class families, upper class families, we all have to deal with adversity. And a family that has experienced trauma sometimes doesn't have the capacity to nurture and support itself when adversity strikes. And so this can send some families into a state of disarray where the idea of social mobility just becomes preposterous. We compartmentalise these problems naturally because, you know, we have a system that has to deal with things separately, but actually there's a lot of overlap. If we were to think about homeless people, some people in prison, people with drug addictions problems, people who can't hold down work, you can usually walk back their difficulties to a point in their own childhood where they became chronically stressed and insecure and fearful. If we were to think about them not only as adults with choices that need to take responsibility, but also formerly children growing up in really hostile circumstances, then this would help us to sort of modulate the discussion around reconciling the need for public services with self-efficacy and personal responsibility, because I do think that that's extremely polarised on the left and right.
Do you think one of the problems with the left is that because with the advent of Thatcherism, where you've got this, you know, demonisation of people from working class communities, from poorer communities, and the reduction of all social problems as the left would have understood them as individual personal defects, laziness, work shy, not trying hard enough, not so bright, that kind of thing. But the left often goes too far in the kind of mirror image of that.
Yes. For me, it's a question of scales. So at the scale in which we are looking at economic systems, political structures, it's inappropriate and unfair to say that a person taking personal responsibility can have an impact on those things. I mean, a person's ability to influence politics is intermittent. Economic system, people are often too consumed with the day-to-day grind of their own experience to contribute towards the activism that's trying to bring about change in that area. But when you zoom in to a person's day-to-day life and the experiential aspect of poverty, what you see is it's key. It's key in conjunction with intuitive, well thought through public services and support. When I made the decision that I had to stop drinking and I had to stop taking drugs, then that was an act of marshalling my self-will and seeking support. Because I was always looking for where harm had been done. I was very much a victim. And this was partly an institutional aspect to that. All of the different services that I interacted with, I was told that the problems in my family were a result of society and that my problems were a result of the family. And actually the reality is that at a certain point in my life when I became an adult, I was irresponsible, I was selfish, and ultimately I had to make a choice. The kind of moral case against poverty was made very clear on the left, and that I certainly could have laid claim to being a victim. I had to resist the temptation for that easy answer. So my argument for personal responsibility in the context of the left is not to placate neoliberalism, but actually it's to make us more robust in terms of how we engage debate, how we manage our lives, and making sure that there's not a massive deficit between who we say we are, who we think we are, and what we actually are.
I think one of the problems, if we look at working class Scotland or working class Britain, there's always been these divisions and fractures. When we talk about the working class, we're not talking about something that's homogenous. I mean, do you think those divisions have widened? And how do you think it's possible today to build organic bonds of solidarity? Not least, the old model, without kind of looking back at, dewy-eyed at a world that didn't exist because it was very male-dominated often. But you did have communities based around mines or docks or factories. You don't around call centres and supermarkets in the same way.
In the book I call it the poverty industry, but I don't mean that pejoratively. It's just I feel like it was a good way to illustrate the fact that a lot of the organisations that have grown up from post-industrialisation in order to sort of manage a lot of the social problems that have happened through idleness, unemployment, demoralisation almost of community psyche. Now we have fictional retail villages that function as the community centre. Yeah. What we do know is that people who feel a sense of community, who feel connected to other people, who feel heard, this increases their well-being, so this increases human capacity. And actually, a lot of the organisations that would regard themselves as like liberal or left-leaning, they've become a little bit detached at times from the fact that actually when working class people try to engage in local democracy or try to engage with institutions or organisations, they find that those aren't set up for them to engage with. A lot of people do want to participate, but it's sort of like it's educated or beaten out of them. Especially in the book, I go into great detail about the frustrations of local groups that have got grassroots experience in communities having to justify their own existence to a rotating pantheon of political people, when really the first thing a politician should do when they're elected is go straight to these grassroots organisations, because they're the experts. They're the people who already have the trust of the community, and that's why they've lasted 20, 30 years while the whole turbulence of a shift in economic emphasis has been going on around them. And that ultimately, if you want to operate in a community, the first thing you want to do is negotiate entry into it.
When we do talk about, in the media, class, inequality and poverty and so on, the lived experiences of people for whom those daily experiences is lacking. How does that change? How do we have organised working class voices who can speak on behalf of communities with lived experience? It's
a tricky one because no one can really claim to speak on behalf of the whole community. I can't really claim to speak for all working class people, or even Pollock, where I come from. Shout out to Pollock, by the way. There's a lot of lip service paid to giving working class people a voice. But people get very anxious when we open up our mouth to speak. If we want action on this, obviously there's the activism, there's the radicalism, there's the fight, and at the level of a movement, you have to be prepared to get your hands dirty and show your teeth at certain points. But running parallel to that, there also has to be, I believe, a willingness to not just internalise a lot of the theories around things like privilege, for example, which can be quickly weaponised without any analysis of the self in conjunction with it. So when I say self-awareness or personal responsibility, it's in conjunction with all these things. It's to make these things more effective. It's to understand the difference between holding someone accountable and just airing out your own personal resentment.
Scottish independence, when the referendum was called, support was on about 20%.
Thought I was getting an easy time here, and now you...
It's got to happen, we can't not talk about it.
No, of course, I'm just joking.
But, it started on 28% and it ended up, 45%, was it? This was not blood and soil, Braveheart nationalism. This was, for many people, about breaking with an unjust order and building a new society. What role did class play in all of that?
Well, what I realised in hindsight was that the Yes movement was a broad church, as they say. It was an umbrella. My gateway in was the radical left. For the radical left, independence is a means to another end, which is why you see the radical left being more receptive to Corbyn, because that represents another route. So for me, class was important in that area, but what I did was I made an assumption that the part of the Yes movement that I interfaced with and engaged with was the whole Yes movement. After the result, without that kind of collective goal in mind, then we started kind of like picking each other apart a little bit. A lot of the people who wave the flags and a lot of the people who are quite easy to kind of joke about for some, a lot of those people were the people who weren't interested in politics before, who became activised by something that spoke to them. But I'm a Yes voter, and I believe in Scottish independence, and I believe in Scottish independence even if it means a big deficit, even if it means taking a hit. So I don't need someone else to say, oh no, but if you vote this way, then that's going to be difficult for you in the long run. Like, I'm prepared to take the hit.
Of course. Because
I think having control of everything from immigration to our taxes and our ability to form our own, we can form our own relationships abroad and stuff like that, but you know, the scope is just not there.
Lots of working class communities in England and Wales voted for Brexit, often quite decisively. That didn't happen in Scotland. Why?
The turnout was low, and it's business as usual in Scotland again in terms of who's politically active, so that I think that the vote reflected a lot of the middle class that came out to vote. Now, I might be wrong on that might just be an assumption. My own personal journey through that issue was that I was undecided until I went in a polling booth, and this is usually the case for me. As much as I consider the issues, I see voting almost like taking a bit of a punt, right? And I'm not a gambler by nature. I voted Remain, and it was because like I used to be a bit heavier than this, right? And I stopped drinking and I started eating a lot of crap. And the labelling on food has helped me to improve my lifestyle. Now, that's a concession that big food producers and multinational companies have had to make because of the collectivism of the European Union being able to exert itself and say, no, you will put these labels on the food whether you like it or not, and if people find out there's lots of rubbish in your food, then that's your problem. And so I just saw that as a very basic way that the European Union was useful, not to absolve it of all of its inconsistencies, contradictions, and the lack of democracy at certain times. But as much as I voted Remain, I felt a lot of solidarity and connection with the communities that voted Brexit. Sometimes political behaviour in working class communities is about striking back against the people that you feel excluded by. So this need for retribution sometimes regiments political behaviour, and that comes first. That's how sometimes you could get people arguably maybe voting against their own interests in certain issues. I mean, I know I certainly have.
In the general election, you actually voted for Labour. Why did you vote for the Labour Party as somebody who is a yeser? And also, if a viable, stable, secure, strong and stable government, if you like, socialist government under Jeremy Corbyn came to power, would you still support independence in that circumstance?
That's something that I'm still considering. For me, actually, it was another one of those, I'm taking a punt here. I withdrew my support for the SNP quite vocally in 2015, and that was just because they had reneged on a couple of pledges that had drawn me to them in the first place. I personally took a lot of criticism for that at the time. You know, I stand by that because I was trying to send them a signal. As a voter, that's the only way really that I can let them know. Like, I'm not happy with the direction that you're taking. I was supporting you since 2006, so I'm just letting you know that it's not unconditional. But I respect people who see the SNP as a route to independence and they will continue to vote for them no matter what, because that's a perfectly legitimate position to take. What I see Corbyn as almost as a sort of interruption to regularly scheduled programming. Yeah. And while the idea of him getting elected sometimes seems quite far in the distance, he does a lot of work in communities. It's a popular movement. I think that's how maybe Corbynism might actually reveal itself to leverage political power. I can't say that I'm not going to be pro-Indy even if Corbyn gets in, because he'll have to move further to the centre. At the same time, I do recognise that it's a shift in tone. I like the way that he is with media. He doesn't play the game. For me, as I'm not always coming at it from a political point of view, right? I'm a bit of a kind of troublemaking artist as well. So there's a part of me that's just kind of sitting back, rubbing my hands, going, I wonder what's going to happen here, which I guess is maybe not politically responsible, but that's my nature, so I enjoy watching it.
I think that will provoke, I hope, a lot of debate and discussion about injustice and about the nuances of working class experience, of the experiences of people living in poverty in Scotland and in Britain as a whole. I want to hear your thoughts on this, maybe your own experiences, the debate, the broader debate about class and inequality. So please do leave your comments as ever. We've got loads of videos, so do click on them. We've got loads of interviews coming up. Love your recommendations as ever. Many of you recommended Loki, so any more of those, keep them coming. And as ever, I'll see you next time.